In the heart of a remote and unforgiving forest, a lone hunter named Arthur embarked on what he thought would be a routine expedition. The sun had just begun to set, casting an eerie glow over the woods, and the air was filled with the familiar sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. But then, something cut through the natural symphony. A series of cries, low and desperate, echoed across the forest, and they were unlike anything Arthur had ever heard before. At first, Arthur's instincts told him to turn back. The sounds were unsettling, almost inhuman, and a creeping sense of dread filled his chest. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. With cautious steps, he moved deeper into the woods, drawn toward the source of the cries. Each step seemed to heighten his awareness, his senses sharpened, his pulse quickened. He was no stranger to the dangers of the wilderness, but what awaited him in the clearing ahead was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. As he reached the clearing, Arthur froze in shock. There, trapped in a snare and entangled in chains and barbed wire, was a massive bear. The animal lay on the ground, panting heavily, its once majestic body reduced to a pitiful state of agony. The bear's fur was matted with blood, and every small movement it made caused it to let out a tortured cry. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he stood face to face with the bear. On any other day, he might have considered this a prime hunting opportunity, but what he saw before him wasn't a challenge for a hunter. It was a scene of pure cruelty. The bear wasn't just trapped. It was suffering, pleading for help in the only way it knew how. Something inside Arthur shifted as he looked into the bear's eyes. An animal he had once viewed as prey now seemed to be begging for mercy. Despite the danger, he made a decision. He would help the bear, no matter the risk. Slowly, Arthur approached the creature, his heart racing as he assessed the situation. The snare had dug deep into the bear's flesh, and the barbed wire had left gaping wounds. The chains wrapped around its limbs were tight, preventing it from even attempting to free itself. Arthur realized that this wasn't going to be a simple task. Freeing the bear would take hours, and there was no guarantee that the animal would survive the ordeal. But he couldn't just walk away. As he got closer, the bear, still terrified and in pain, lashed out with a powerful swipe of its paw, narrowly missing Arthur. The hunter stumbled back, instinctively reaching for his weapons, but then he stopped. He knew that showing aggression would only escalate the situation. Instead, Arthur did something unexpected. He placed his weapons on the ground, disarming himself completely. He stood before the bear with his hands empty, showing that he meant no harm. The bear, though still wary, seemed to recognize this gesture. Its growls quieted, and its eyes, though filled with pain, softened just enough to allow Arthur to move closer. It was a fragile moment of trust between man and beast, and Arthur knew that any wrong move could cost him his life. But he pressed on, carefully examining the snare and the chains, searching for a way to free the creature. With a small knife, Arthur began cutting through the snare, working methodically to avoid causing the bear more pain. Each strand of wire fought against him, its sharp edges biting into his hands, but he continued, determined to free the bear. The air was thick with the smell of blood and fear, and the forest seemed to hold its breath as Arthur worked. Slowly, the chains began to fall away, clattering to the ground with each cut. Next came the barbed wire. This part of the task was even more delicate, as the wire had dug deep into the bear's skin, leaving painful gashes that would take weeks to heal. Arthur's hands trembled as he worked, but he knew there was no turning back now. Every movement was careful and precise, as he tried his best not to cause the bear any more suffering. The animal's labored breathing filled his ears, a constant reminder of the urgency of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Arthur removed the last piece of wire. The bear lay still for a moment, its body heaving with exhaustion. Arthur stepped back, his own body trembling with fatigue and relief. He had done it. He had freed the bear. But as he looked at the creature before him, a deep sadness settled over him. The bear's once powerful frame was now battered and broken, its fur matted with blood and dirt, its eyes dull with pain. This was not the untamed creature Arthur had admired from a distance. This was a victim of cruelty, and it was clear that the bear wouldn't survive on its own. Arthur knelt beside the bear, extending a hand toward it. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The bear, though weak, leaned into Arthur's touch. For the first time in what must have been days, the creature was experiencing kindness. Arthur stayed with the bear for a while, offering what little comfort he could. Eventually, the bear began to stir, struggling to rise to its feet. Arthur watched, unsure of what to do next. He couldn't leave the bear here, but how could he possibly help it further? As the bear took its first shaky steps, it did something unexpected. It followed Arthur. The hunter, surprised but determined, led the bear back through the woods toward his cabin. Once they arrived, Arthur wasted no time. He reached for his phone and called the local wildlife clinic, explaining the situation in desperate tones. The clinic, recognizing the urgency, dispatched a team immediately. While they waited, Arthur sat beside the bear, speaking to it in soft tones, as if his words alone could ease its pain. When the wildlife rescue team arrived, they sedated the bear and began their work. The injuries were severe: infected wounds, deep gashes, and a possible fracture. Without immediate care, the bear might not survive the night. The team worked quickly, cleaning the wounds, administering antibiotics, and stitching the bear's torn flesh. Arthur stood by, his guilt gnawing at him. He had spent years hunting animals like this one, but now he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. As the team finished their work, one of the veterinarians approached Arthur with grim news. "This bear isn't the only one," she said. "We've had several reports of similar injuries in the past few weeks. It's likely that someone is setting these traps intentionally. This is no accident." The revelation hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. Someone was out there, torturing animals for sport. His anger flared, and he knew that he couldn't let this continue. He had to find the person responsible and stop them before more animals suffered the same fate. Over the next few days, Arthur became consumed with the mission to find the culprit. He set up surveillance cameras in the forest and worked closely with the wildlife clinic and local authorities. The hunting community, horrified by the cruelty being inflicted on the animals, rallied behind him. Together, they vowed to put an end to the reign of terror in the woods. But the perpetrator was elusive. Days turned into nights, and still, there were no leads. Arthur's frustration grew with each passing hour, but he refused to give up. Then, one fateful night, a sound outside his cabin jolted him awake. Peering out the window, he saw a figure disappearing into the trees. Without hesitation, Arthur grabbed his flashlight and followed. The chase led him deep into the woods, where he stumbled upon a makeshift campsite. There, amidst the tools of cruelty, wire cutters, barbed wire, and snares, stood the man responsible. Arthur's blood boiled as he realized that he had finally found the person who had caused so much suffering. Fueled by anger and determination, Arthur confronted the man, tackling him to the ground and restraining him. The authorities arrived shortly after, taking the man into custody. Under pressure, the perpetrator led them to the remaining traps in the forest, and Arthur, along with the police and wildlife officers, worked to dismantle each one. By dawn, the forest was free of the cruel devices that had plagued it. In the days that followed, the bear that Arthur had saved made a remarkable recovery. When it was strong enough, it was released back into the wild, free from the chains that had once bound it. Arthur watched from a distance as the bear disappeared into the woods, a sense of peace washing over him. The man responsible for the cruelty faced justice, sentenced to decades behind bars for his crimes. The community, galvanized by the events, implemented new laws to protect the wildlife and ensure that such atrocities would never happen again. As the seasons changed, Arthur found himself returning to the woods, not as a hunter, But as a guardian, the forest, once tainted by cruelty, had healed and life thrived once more. Arthur, too, had found redemption, his heart forever changed by the bear he had saved. And though he would never forget the horrors he had witnessed, he took comfort in the knowledge that even in the darkest of places, there is always the chance for a new beginning.